ცოტა ვინმე თუ შეძლებს იმაზე ზუსტი პასუხის გაცემას ვიდრე თქვენ, რატომ არ მოსწონს ევროკავშირს და დასავლეთ ზოგადად საქართველოს სტრატეგიულ პარტნიორებს ის ინიცირებული კანონი, რომელსაც საზოგადოებამ ჩემი აზრით აბსოლუტურად სამართლიანად უწოდა ეგრეთ წოდებული რუსული კანონი, რატომ არის მიუღებელი ევროკავშირისთვის და დასავლეთისთვის ზოგადად ამ კანონის ინიცირება.
Thanks, Dato. It's a pleasure to have the opportunity to discuss in more depth, also with the audience, some of the issues which indeed are quite sensitive at a very peculiar time in the development of EU-Georgia relations. Now, you ask about the Foreign Agents Law. It has a different name officially, but maybe shorthand is what I will use like this. Where to start? I think it is already clear prior to the adoption of the law how it will be implemented. We see, I just crossed the street and you see the posters of, I suppose, a civil society organization. One of his members may live there with their faces crossed out, and these are fascist practices. We've seen this in the lead up to the Second World War. We've seen this in Russia, where we have the most recent and pertinent example of the implementation of the same type of law. We've seen the beatings, of course, of opposition leaders, the intimidation, phone calls, etc. This law and the way it is being conceived is intended to stigmatize on a personalized level pre-identified civil society organizations who will now also be included in a database of undesirables and gone after on the simple criterion of receiving a threshold of their income, from abroad. This is not the type of transparency law that the European Union or its member states have been adopting for themselves. The European Union, as the leaders of the GD party have alluded to on numerous occasions, do have transparency legislation, obviously. But it is much more targeted in the sense that it goes after the intermediaries of foreign countries, pre-identified autocratic regimes, Russia, China, Turkey, in the case of the French law, Belarus, etc. And it does not target specifically the funding arrangements of them, but actually the actions of serving the interests of a third country through malign interferences in domestic procedures, whether that's elections or media and disinformation, etc. And that's the first key difference, I think. And the second is that in all of the European legislation, whether it's the EU legislation or the French intelligence law or the transparency legislation in other member states, you have solid safeguards in terms of judicial protection against any type of overreach by the authorities. There are independent bodies and judicial scrutiny which is foreseen in the stipulations of these legislation, which is frankly lacking in the Georgian case, which of course makes the Foreign Agents Law, as it is now up for a third reading, a document which is rather fuzzy in definitional scope, in implementation of very punitive sanctions. I mean, the penalties which are foreseen in several thresholds there could basically bankrupt quasi-immediately civil society organizations that are being targeted. And it doesn't have the type of, due diligence procedures and due process guarantees that the European legislation has. So it's obvious that you would see the European Parliament in its resolution or high-level statements by leaders of the EU institutions or member states criticize this particular law.
თქვენ ახსენეთ რომ ამ კანონის მიზანი და სულისკვეთება სავარაუდოდ არის ადამიანების ჯგუფების სტიგმატიზება, მათი მონიშნა, მათი დასჯა, ორგანიზაციების შემწეობის გარეშე დატოვება და ასე შემდეგ. მოდით ამ ყველაფერს შევხედოთ უკვე რუსეთში არსებული გამოცდილებით. რუსეთში თუ არ ვწები 2012 წელს მიიღეს მსგავსი კანონი, მაგრამ მოდით ამ კანონს შევხედოთ პერსპექტივაში. როგორ განვითარდა, როგორი სახე მიიღო, იმანაც თავდაპირველად დაითესა და როგორ განვითარდა, ასე ვთქვათ, რა ამოიზარდა ამ კანონიდან. როგორ უყურებთ აი ამ კანონს პერსპექტივაში? სადამდე შეიძლება მივიდეს?
Well, we've seen in the case of Russia, of course, a gradual elimination of civil society organizations. Some of the high-profile ones, like Memorial and others, were spared in the beginning, but have in the end also been closed down. I mean, essentially, the entire field of civil society organizations has been obliterated in the last decade, or a little more than that. It wouldn't even need to take that long for the Georgian Dream-led government to achieve the exact same thing. Because the legislation and the acceleration already of intimidation and repression that we are seeing could, of course, lead quite quickly to the closure of several civil society organizations. If they register, of course, under the law, or if they are involuntarily registered by the government. There are legal ways around that, of course, in trying to seek accreditation, if you want, abroad. Obviously, several EU member states could be looked at as providing, a legal framework to set up a legal entity, basically, to operate from abroad. But whether that would safeguard the type of operations in the longer run is still questionable, I think.
მოდით ვისაუბროთ იმ პოზიციების განსხვავებებზე, რომელიც აქვს მაგალითად საქართველოს ხელისუფლებას და სამოქალაქო საზოგადოებას. ჩვენ დღის დასაწყისში უკვე ვილაპარაკეთ იმაზე, რომ სამოქალაქო საზოგადოების ძალიან მკვეთრი, ძალიან მკაფიო პოზიცია ჩანს, ისმის, ხმაურიანია და როგორც თქვენ თავად დაგვიდასტურეთ, ეს შესამჩნევია ევროკავშირისთვისაც. რა მიჯნა არსებობს ევროპელი პოლიტიკოსების მხრიდან, როგორ უყურებენ ისინი საქართველოს სამოქალაქო საზოგადოების პოზიციას და მე დიდი იმედი მაქვს, რომ დარწმუნებული ვარ, რომ ეს არის უმრავლესობის აზრი და პოზიცია და ხელისუფლების პოზიციას. როგორ შეიძლება, რომ ორი სხვადასხვა სამოქმედო გეგმა ქონდეს, ასე ვთქვათ, ევროკავშირის სამხრეთ.
Maybe to distinguish between two things. One, in the political statements that have been issued over the last couple of weeks, there's no doubt that the political leadership of the EU institutions and several member states have chosen basically to side with the civil society organizations that are clamoring for the protection and the promotion of European values in the end. Transparency in the proper sense, of course, freedom from beatings, freedom of expression, freedom of the media, etc. That's one aspect. I think we have statements by President von der Leyen, of the European Commission, of High Representative Borrell, of European Council President Charles Michel, the European Parliament resolution that I already referred to, etc. I mean, the ambassadors here, the Director General Koopman, who was on visit 2 weeks ago. So I think there in the public messaging and the strategic communication, it's relatively clear where the EU stands. Now, the second dimension to answer your question might be, what would be the assessment at this current stage of the adherence by Georgia, i.e. the Georgian government in the lead of the country, in the adherence to the 9 steps which have been identified by the European Commission and, of course, proposed by the European Council, that need to be taken in order to move Georgia to the next stage of the pre-accession process, which would be a decision by the European Council to open membership talks. Now, if you look at the latest report, which was issued by the European Commission in March of this year, it's already clear that at that time, very little progress had been made compared to the previous reporting period, November 8, and 6 months before, the summer, etc. So, since March of this year, we've seen, of course, the Foreign Agents Law. We've seen, through an accelerated procedure in Parliament, the abolishment of gender quota for political parties. We've seen the LGBTIQ plus rights being hollowed out in new draft legislative initiatives. We've seen amendments to the tax code. If you take each of those headings and you put them against, the 9 steps which have been identified by the European Commission as endorsed by the European Council, then it's clear. Gender quota for political representation in electoral processes sufficiently in advance of the election day, step number 4, is clearly, being infringed by the gender quota decision. The amendment to the tax code, step, 8, which foresees, de-oligarchization, is probably not being met if you create a system whereby, the offshore wealth of oligarchs can be re-imported into the country at favorable conditions. And so if you look at each of those steps, basically, you could link up, the initiatives which have been taken over the last couple of months by the ruling party and basically conclude. You don't have to take it from me, by the way. There were 8 Nordic Baltic states who yesterday, I think, issued a statement saying that all of these steps are taking Georgia back from where the direction of travel that should be taken. And so I think the interim conclusion as of yet is pretty clear. This is a clear step back from the pre-accession path of Georgia.
თქვენი ეს რეალური შედეგები შეიძლება მოყვეს ამ კანონის მიღებას, წეგან ახსენეთ უვიზო მიმოსვლის შეჩერება, გადახედვა, არ ვიცი, სანქციები და ასე შემდეგ. თქვენი გამოცდილებით რამდენად მყისიერი პასუხი აქვს ხოლმე ევროკავშირს მსგავს ნაბიჯებზე და რა პასუხი შეიძლება იყოს ეს?
I should start by saying that the first action by the European Commission as the executive of the European Union in the face of either a member state or a candidate country retracting on their commitments on the fundamentals of the integration process, human rights, fundamental freedoms, rule of law, democracy promotion, etc. The first reaction is always to engage in dialogue. And this is what we have seen also in the case of Georgia. Appeals by the European Union through the statements, please, ruling party, correct the direction of travel that you're currently in. If this doesn't help, then indeed, there are more forcible measures that can be adopted. More restrictive measures are already being talked about between member state capitals. Of course, with the Commission and the European Parliament has suggested in its resolution not just to scrap the visa-free travel regime, but also to suspend candidate country status for Georgia. I am personally not of the opinion that these would be wise steps as far as punishing the culprits of the government's actions are concerned, because in the end, the people of Georgia, the citizens of Georgia that benefit, and who've been from the visa-free travel, and who have been awarded by the 27 member states with a prospect of EU enlargement. It was vocally expressed like that. It was for the people, not necessarily for the government of Georgia. They would be on the receiving end of the stick in that respect. Still, there is something to be said for taking negative measures. This could be at the lowest level, of course, withholding or delaying funds, financial support, which Georgia, and especially the government, would all otherwise receive in terms of the financial aid that, pre-accession comes with. There could be the suspension of such financial support. There could, of course, then also be visa-free travel, of which you could pose the counter-argument in saying, well, if you have a temporary suspension of visa-free travel, it would complicate matters a little bit for Georgians who travel. You would have to go back to embassies and get a visa, yes. But it wouldn't become impossible to travel, right? And it would be a temporary measure as well. And yet it would, as a political signal, be quite strong to put extra pressure on the ruling party, to change tack. So there is something to be said, actually, for such a visa-free travel suspension. But the criteria which are listed in the regulation by the European Union are quite clear. They have to basically invoke either a surge of asylum seekers from Georgia to one member state, sufficient. Basically, this could be an executive decision by the European Commission on its own, or on the invitation of a member state that feels that all of a sudden it is being, flooded with asylum applications, or a threat to the internal order of that member state because of illegal arrivals or disruptors to the internal peace of the country, etc. But those are the criteria that would have to be followed there. And I wonder, there has been a spike, of course, in asylum applications. The October 2023 report is quite clear, but none of the member states at this moment in time are in a position where they say, okay, we can't handle, the influx of Georgian asylum seekers. So, but it is set on a number of criteria which are a bit different from the situation we're talking about here. Why do I think? And it has only been invoked, to my knowledge, in the case of Russia. Complete abandonment of the visa-free regime, and a partial one in the case of Belarus. And then there are some other countries around the world, but basically in the neighborhood, for similar type of reasons, those would be the two examples that stick out. On the decision to suspend candidate country status, I don't think it has ever happened, unless someone corrects me. De facto, of course, this is the case for Turkey. Turkey has started accession negotiations, but because it is unwilling to open its ports and airports to the southern part of Cyprus, the Republic of Cyprus, Nicosia has basically blocked further accession talks with Turkey, effectively freezing or suspending its process. I think rather than formally suspending or formally withdrawing it, I think diplomatically, politically, that's quite a strong signal to take, and would run counter, I think, to the philosophy that the European Council adopted in the first place, which was to grant candidate country status, first a European perspective, then candidate country status, to honor basically the 80% approval rate of the Georgian population to seek accession to the European Union. So I think I would be rather careful on that point.
ცოტა უკან რო დავბრუნდეთ. ბევრ მოქალაქეს ვერ ამოუხსნია თუ რატომ დასჭირდა საქართველოს ხელისუფლებას მართლ პარტიას უпростоრად აი ამ კანონის ხელახლა ინიცირება, მით უმეტეს მაშინ, როდესაც გასულ წელს მკაფიოდ თქვა, რომ ამ კანონის ინიცირება აღარ მოხდებოდა. ერთი შეხედვით მოსახლეობა ფიქრობს, რომ მათ ჰქონდათ ძალიან მშვიდი წინასაარჩევნო პერიოდი და შეეძლოთ, რომ აი ასე მისულიყვნენ არჩევნებდა. თუმცა შემოატრიალეს კანონპროექტი, რომელმაც თავდაყირა დააყენა ყველაფერი და მათ შორის თავდაყირა დააყენა მათივე ურთიერთობები დასავლელ პარტნიორებთან. თქვენი გამოცდილებით, რა შეიძლება იყოს იმის მიზეზი, რომ აი ამ წინასაარჩევნო პერიოდში ქართულ მოცემებამ გადაწყვიტა ამ კანონის ხელახლა ინიცირება?
There are certainly better people placed in this room than me to answer that question. And so I would appeal to you to maybe intervene on this. My humble reading would be that it's an attempt to make sure that the JD wins the upcoming elections in October. You clear the field from any objectively critical organization that might monitor the elections, as has happened in the previous time. You make it impossible for them, to get organized in that respect, but actually crack down on them. Then you can more easily, of course, organize the elections to your own to your own willingness. So this would be my answer. I think fear of losing the absolute majority and fear of the leader of the party, of course, for his own position and wealth. I think this is what driving, the Georgian Dream's reinitiation of the law. But again, I speak under your authority.
როგორ ფიქრობთ? ის სავარაუდო პასუხი და რეაქციათა წყება, ასე ვთქვათ, რომელიც თქვენ ახსენეთ, რაც შეიძლება ევროკომისიამ და ევროპარლამენტმა გამოიყენოს ამ კანონის საბოლოოდ მიღების და შემდეგ ვეტოს დაძლევის შემთხვევაში. არის შეიძლება ეს იყოს უვიზო რეჟიმის გაუქმება, ან დახმარებების შეწყვეტა, ან კანდიდატის სტატუსის პირობითად შეჩერება. ხომ არ შეიძლება რომ ეს ყველაფერი საპირისპიროდ გამოიყენოს მართველმა ძალამ იმ სახის პროპაგანდისთვის, რომ ევროკავშირმა საქართველოს ხელი კრა.
Yes, the answer is yes. They would most certainly abuse it to their own benefit. Still, if we look at it from the EU's perspective, in order not to corrupt its own enlargement policy, it needs to uphold certain standards. If a candidate country that chose to apply for membership with a majority backing of its population, its government chooses to do differently, then the restrictive measures will follow, hoping that they will change the mind of the government if they are targeted enough, or heap scorn basically on the demonstrators to put pressure on the JD to turn position. I think this is the logic of these sequence of consequences of these restrictive measures. Of course, there will be abuse. It is quite striking. Two things, perhaps. On the one hand, to hear the Prime Minister here this morning say, we are basically almost the best pupil in the class, and we will help the European Union overcome its internal, problems with diversity and rule of law and economics. Okay, great. And then to see, what the goons of the government are basically doing on the streets, beating up people, stigmatizing them in the poster, parade, with call centers basically intimidating normal people and diplomatic staff of member states who have a Georgian number, I learned today. I mean, that's quite staggering in and of itself. But going back to, the big speech, what was it, 29th of April, to cast the European Union and its member states and the United States, the West, as the opposition, that's quite strange for a candidate country of the European Union. So, okay. And the reaction from the EU side cannot otherwise be then, one of taking distance and then hoping that the measures which are being adopted, of course, have sufficient force to change the country's course for the better.
Keti Vashagize from Euro Foundation, and we're one of the non-profit foundations that support also, we're also grant maker, and we support other non-profit foundations for over 20 years already. So it's, of course, we see the law as affecting the course of Georgia, but it directly affects groups that we support and the foundation, of course. But I have two questions. I have to look at the larger picture, and if you can comment about the politics in Europe and the upcoming elections, and how the results of the elections you think they affect the Georgia and other states in our region. And your comment about the speech on 29th or today's comments by the Prime Minister saying that and having the hope that they have allies in European Union that will take them to, probably without us, I don't know, but take them into as members of Europe. And the second question that I have is about, we saw what happened in Russia on Azerbaijan, and European Union and the member state in some cases continue to support civil society groups there. What we see now, even in Azerbaijan, Europe continues to, European Commission to spend some funds there, and something that we're not gonna, if we're not registered and we're not registering in the, as an enemies of the state, as an agents, who will take on, and how Europe might continue to support the groups that will stay locally. Thank you.
European parliamentary elections are second-order type of elections. In fact, we're talking about 27 member states organizing European elections according to their own electoral laws, and with a political landscape which is quite different and motivated by different energies, or energies by different motives. And so second order in a sense that, especially in countries where European parliamentary elections take place on the same day as national elections, it's hard to, for voters to distinguish clearly how to vote. They have to be quite knowledgeable, in fact, about the candidates and their programs at both levels to be able to do so. That's one. On the outcome of the European parliamentary elections, there's consistent polling that suggests that there will be a further swing to the right. The current Liberal Democratic ALDE grouping, which is the third biggest grouping after the Conservative and the Social Democrats, which will remain more or less in size, if we can believe the polling. That Liberal grouping, the third one, is about to drop quite significantly to the benefit, and the Greens as well, to the benefit of the European Conservative and Reformist Party, and then the Identity Party, which is quite far extreme to the right. The ECR grouping, which is predicted to become third, is led by Giorgia Meloni's Brothers of Italy party, which is vocally anti-Russian, as opposed to the even further right party, but of course quite strong on issues of migration, etc., etc. So I think for a parliamentary majority to be found on hot button issues like that, it will be key, especially for the European Conservative Party, the EPP, to come to in a dialogue and agreement, compromise with that third biggest grouping. Does it change much in terms of foreign policy direction of the European Union? No, the European Parliament does not have real competences there. They lie with the member states. Does it change a lot as far as the EU enlargement file is concerned, and Georgia in particular? Well, you may see more vocal expressions which, tend to veer to the right, but in a way that might be beneficial to the Georgian dream government. I mean, you talked, and this was your second question, about a kind of, member state that sponsors Georgia, from within the European Union and helps its case. Of course, we've seen the bromance between your Prime Minister and Viktor Orban of Hungary. Yes, whether that's the type of sponsor that Georgia can rely on when looking at the majority of member states who look at Hungary, I'm not so confident that this is the best promoter of the Georgian cause in that respect. And then to your third sub-question, as far as EU support for civil society organizations in clear-cut absolute autocracies is concerned, Belarus, Russia, it's true that the EU continues to fund them in exile, primarily, and has support programs for them. There's still the Free Belarus political parties and NGOs that get a lot of support from that. I would hope that Georgia does not travel the same direction as Belarus, that it doesn't get that far, right? So let's not speculate too much about that.
It is also very unfortunate that we have to have this discussion of this subject at the times of the. But anyways, we've heard many times what the expectations of the EU are in regards to the government itself. But what, in your opinion, as the representative of the EU, is the expectations in regards to the people themselves, ordinary citizens? So we've seen many mass protests across the country. But what is the end game in your opinion for the ordinary citizens themselves? Because as you have mentioned also, 80% support the EU accession and don't support mostly this draft law. So what is your opinion in this regards, that the EU has the expectations in regards to these citizens? Thank you.
Thank you for your question. I think it's, rather than talking about EU integration, I think the bigger goal is about reinstating full democracy with all of its rights and freedoms for all Georgians, and thereby to stay clear of the reintegration path with Russian and autocracy type governments. I think that is the big prize to look for. EU integration will then happen, quasi-automatically. I hope, of course, there's further reforms to be done, absolutely, but the precondition for all of that is, of course, that Georgian citizens who are out in the streets prevent a total capture of their country, of the economy, by a kleptocratic elite that serves itself. I think that's the big prize.
First of all, thank you. It's a pleasure to hear you and listen to you. I have a question about the EU itself. They're making only statements about the Georgian agents law, about the foreign influence, and they're not drafting any sanctions for the Georgian government and parliament, members of parliament. What do you think about it? I think it's time for sanctions from the EU.
Thank you for your question. We talked about it a little bit already. The talks are happening, and several ideas have been pitched. I mentioned the European Parliament's resolution, but in conversations, in several capitals of the European Union or in Brussels, people are preparing for this. That doesn't mean that they're actually drafting it already. I mean, your expectation is, okay, it needs to be quicker. Yes, I probably feel the same as you, but one has to realize, of course, that the European integration machine is that of 27 countries that have to seek a compromise. And we talked about one outlier already, which in the case of adoption of sanctions against Russia for much clear-cut violations, has held back. And so it takes time to overcome such obstacles in the decision shaping and making processes in the European Union. But the talks are happening.
Thank you for interesting input, and I just have one question, Stephen. As we already see, the Georgian government seems more like adopting the multi-vector foreign policy, whatever that means. Like you remember the last year Georgia government signed strategic agreement with China, then we have this special agreement between ruling party of Georgian Dream and Chinese Communist Party. So things are going very strangely. And how this, just imagine if everything goes well, except what is happening here today, how this is inconsistent and how this can be in line with EU foreign and security foreign policy. Do you recall such a country which has this kind of multi-vectoral foreign policy and which then can be somehow included in in EU foreign and security foreign policy and can be part of this European policy? Thank you.
Thanks, Corneli. Your question is a tricky one because it is much easier for the European Union as a collective, to try and put pressure on a candidate country to align its foreign and security policy positions and actions with the common positions of the European Union, which would come with a certain de-risking from China, for example. It is much harder for the European Union to do that with existing member states. Xi Jinping went to France, didn't achieve much. France didn't either, by the way. I'm not sure whether the cognac deal really happened there. He went to Serbia, EU candidate country, signing all kinds of agreements, basically taking a strategic partnership, the first of its kind for a European country, with the PRC, the People's Republic of China. And he went to Hungary to sign a raft of investment agreements, as indeed also a security agreement. With Serbia, the European Union can put pressure. I mean, there's no way for Hungary to try and block this, move from the other 26 countries. It would put pressure on Serbia in this respect. But for a member state, foreign and security policy in particular remains a parallel competence. I mean, this is still one of, the jealously safeguarded policies of member states within the European Union. This is not supranational policy or competence. So, as far as Georgia is concerned, a multi-vector foreign policy, Turkey has one too, many candidate countries have. It just means that there is a delay in the end, as long as there is no full, alignment to CFSP decisions and positions.
Hello, I am a school student and I have a question. You know that there are a lot of people right now in the streets that are protesting this law, including myself, and I am interested, what do you think is the key in resolving this problem? I understand that we have some things to do and also the government has its things to resolve. But what do you think is the key as a society? What do you think is our main thing to improve to resolve this problem? And thank you.
Oh dear. That's probably the most difficult question of all, to which I don't have a satisfactory answer, I'm afraid, but I can try. The reason why it is so important to be in Tbilisi for these Europe days, 9th of May until the happenings today, is exactly because this is the European capital where the European values are most vividly defended through civic participation. We've seen that, of course, in different European capitals in recent years. We can only hope that Georgia will not develop in the way that the Euromaidan developed in Kiev. But the analogies are not far apart, I'm afraid. We're talking about an oligarch in power, not the president of the country perhaps, but the shadow puppet master, who has put essentially everything on the line. What can you expect more from a population that already supports, an aspiration for European values, for European integration of the country, that mobilizes in such numbers, in a peaceful manner, in a dignified way? What can you ask for more? I really don't know. This is why I said, this is the most difficult answer to a question to answer. I suppose it would be to keep up the pressure, to go to the demonstration this evening, if the law is passed in third reading next week, to continue doing so. If a veto comes from the president, keep on going, because you know that the JD will look for a supermajority by the end of May. The elections in October, so this could be a very hot summer for Georgia. I hope it will not be a violent one. And maybe even if the EU doesn't decide on suspending visa-free travel, it might be wise to stay at home and keep your momentum up. I think from our side, I should also say that it's critically important that high-level visits from the United States, from the European Union, from individual member states keep coming. The fact that you have the heads of foreign affairs committees of several national parliaments coming next week, and the speaker of your parliament doesn't find the time to meet with them, okay, fine. But drip, 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 drip. Hopefully, that will, that drip feed will resolve the issue in the end.
ჩვენი საუბრის დასასრულს მეც დავსვამ ერთ შეკითხვას. იმასთან დაკავშირებით, როდემდე გაგრძელდება ეს წვეთვა, რომელიც თქვენ ახსენეთ, პრინციპში კანდიდატის სტატუსი ჩვენ, ასე ვთქვათ, რეგიონში არსებული მდგომარეობიდან გამომდინარე, შემთხვევით მოგვეცა ამის შანსი და შესაძლებლობა და რაღაცნაირად ხელოვნურად ხდება აი ამ შესაძლებლობის ჩამორთმევა ჩვენი ქვეყნისთვის. ჩვენ შეგვიძლია რომ უკეთესი იმედი გქონდეს, მაგრამ უარესიც უნდა ვიფიქროთ. იმ შემთხვევაში, თუ კი კანონი საბოლოოდ იქნება მიღებული, ვეტო დაძლეული და გაფუჭდება, ასე ვთქვათ, საბოლოოდ ურთიერთობა ევროკავშირთან და დასავლელ პარტნიორებთან. თქვენი წარმოდგენით, რამდენი ხნით ჩაიკეტება საქართველოსთვის დასავლეთის კარი?
That's very hypothetical, to which I don't have a scientifically defensible argument. But you point to an issue which is quite key, I think, and I mentioned this morning as well. When I hear the EU ambassador here or other politicians or leaders of the EU member states say that this is a window of historic opportunity, I actually believe that's the case. It sounds corny, but I think it is actually true, because public opinion within the European Union can change as well. And if suspension happens of any kind, of negative conditionality of projects, okay, more easily to overcome. Visa-free travel may be temporary at first, but temporary may become longer term, which then may be more difficult to reverse for political reasons. If more drastic steps are taken, then the realignment of the 27 stars of the member states will become more difficult still. And the international environment may have changed as well, of course. So this is why I believe that indeed, 3 years ago, no one expected that Georgia would be in this position it is now. It is there because of an amalgamation of factors sees the opportunity now indeed, or it might indeed not come again.
დიდი მადლობა. მე მგონი შეკითხვები აღარ გვაქვს. მე მაინც კიდევ ერთხელ პროტოკოლისთვის ვიტყვი, რომ ამ ღონისძიებაზე გამოთქმული მოსაზრებები და იდეები ეკუთვნის მომხსენებლებს და მონაწილეებს და შესაძლოა ისინი არ გამოხატავდეს ევროკავშირის შეხედულებებს. ევროკავშირის წარმომადგენლობა არ არის პასუხისმგებელი ღონისძიების ფარგლებში გამოთქმული განცხადებების ან მოსაზრებების შინაარსზე.